Chapter 11 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 11. The Buzzard. Most animals have their human counterparts, and in that room where Jerry Strann had fallen, a whimsical observer might have termed Jerry, with his tawny head, the lion, and O'Brien behind the bar, a shaggy bear, and the deputy marshal a wolverine, fat but dangerous. And here stood a man as ugly and hardened as a desert cayuse, and there was Dan Barry, sleek and supple as a panther. But among the rest this whimsical observer must have noticed a fellow of prodigious height and negligible breadth, a structure of sinews and bones that promised to rattle in the wind, a long, narrow head, a nose like a beak, tiny eyes set close together and shining like polished buttons, and a vast Adam's apple that rolled up and down the scraggy throat. He might have done for the spirit of famine in an old play, but every dweller of the mountain desert would have found an apter expression by calling him the Buzzard of the scene. Through his prodigious ugliness he was known far and wide as Haw Haw Langley, for on occasion Langley laughed, and his laughter was an indescribable sound that lay somewhere between the braying of a mule and the cawing of a crow. But Haw Haw Langley was usually silent, and he would sit for hours without words, twisting his head and making little pecking motions as his eyes fastened on face after face. All the bitterness of the mountain desert was in Haw Haw Langley. If his body looked like a buzzard, his soul was the soul of the vulture itself, and therefore he had followed the courses of Jerry Strann up and down the range. He stuffed his gorge with the fragments of his leader's food. He fed his soul with the dangers which Jerry Strann met and conquered. In the bar room Haw Haw Langley had stood turning his sharp little eyes from Jerry Strann to Dan Barry, and from Dan Barry back to Strann, and when the shot was fired something like a grin twisted his thin lips, and when the spot of red glowed on the breast of the staggering man the eyes of Haw Haw blazed as if with the reflection of a devouring fire. Afterwards he lingered for a few minutes, making no effort to aid the fallen man, but when he had satisfied himself with the extent of the injury, and when he had noted the froth of bloody bubbles which stained the lips of Strann, Haw Haw Langley turned and stalked from the room. His eyes were points of light, and his soul was crammed to repletion with ill tidings. At the hitching rack he stepped into the saddle of a diminutive horse, whirled it into the street with a staggering jerk of the reins, and buried the spurs deep in the cow pony's flanks. The poor brute snorted and flirted its heels in the air, but Langley wrapped his long legs around the barrel of his mount and goaded it again. His smile, which began with the crack of Barry's gun in O'Brien's place, did not die out until he was many a mile away, headed far up through the mountains. But as he put peak after peak behind him, and as the white light of the day diminished and puffs of blue shadow drowned the valleys, the grin disappeared from Haw Haw's face. He became keenly intent on his course until, having reached the very summit of a tall hill, he came to a halt and peered down before him. It was nearly dusk by this time, and the eyes of an ordinary man could not distinguish a tree from a rock at any great distance. But it seemed that Haw Haw was gifted with eyes extraordinary. The buzzard at the top of its sky-towering circles does not see the brown carcass far below with more certainty than Haw Haw sensed his direction. He waited only a few seconds before he rolled the rowels once more along the scored flanks of his mustang, and then plunged down the slope at a reckless gallop. His destination was a hut, or rather a lean-to, that pressed against the side of the mountain, a crazy structure with a single length of stovepipe leaning awry from the roof. And at the door of this house Haw Haw Langley drew rein and stepped to the ground. The interior of the hut was dark, But Haw Haw stole with the caution of a wild Indian to the entrance and reconnoitered the interior, probing every shadowy corner with his glittering eyes. For several long moments he continued this examination, and even when he was satisfied that there was no one in the place, he did not enter, but moved back several paces from the door and swept the sides of the mountains with an uneasy eye. He made out, a short distance from the door, a picketed horse, which now reared up its head from the miserable scattering of grass on which it fed, and stared at the stranger. The animal must have bulked at least twice as large as the mount which had brought Langley to the mountainside, and it was muscled even out of proportion to its bulk. The head was so tremendously broad that it gave an almost square appearance, the neck short and thick, the forelegs disproportionately small but very sturdy, and the whole animal was built on a slope towards the hindquarters, which seemed to equal in massiveness all the rest of the body. One would have said that the horse was a freak meant by nature for the climbing of hills, and to glance at it no man could suppose that those ponderous limbs might be moved to a gallop. However, Haw Haw Langley well knew the powers of the ugly beast, and he even made a detour and walked about the horse to view it more closely. Now he again surveyed the darkening landscape, and then turned once more to the house. This time he entered with the boldness of a possessor approaching his hearth. He lighted a match, and with this ignited a lantern hanging from the wall to the right of the door. The furnishings of the dwelling were primitive beyond compare. There was no sign of a chair. A huddle of blankets on the bare boards of the floor made the bed. A saddle hung by one stirrup on one side, and on the other side leaned the skins of bobcats, lynx, and coyotes on their stretching and drying boards. Haw Haw took down the lantern and examined the pelts. The animals had been skinned with the utmost dexterity. As far as he could see, the hides had not been marred in a single place by slips of the knife, nor were there any bloodstains to attest hurried work, or careless shooting in the first place. The inner surfaces shone with the pure white of old parchment. But Haw Haw gave his chief attention to the legs and the heads of the skins, for these were the places where carelessness or stupidity with the knife were sure to show, but the work was perfect in every respect, until even the critical Haw Haw Langley was forced to step back and shake his head in admiration. He continued his survey of the room. In one corner stood a rifle and a shotgun. In another was a pile of provisions, bacon, flour, salt, meal, and little else. Spices and condiments were apparently unknown to this hermit, nor was there even the inevitable coffee, nor any of the molasses or other sweets which the tongue of the desert mountaineer cannot resist. Flour, meat, and water, it seemed, made up the entire fare of the trapper. For cookery, there was an unboarded space in the very center of the floor, with a number of rocks grouped around in the hole and blackened with soot. The smoke must rise, therefore, and escape through the small hole in the center of the roof. The length of stovepipe which showed on the roof must have been simply the inhabitants' idea of giving the last delicate touch of civilization. It was like a tassel to the cap of the Turk. As Haw Haw's observations reached this point, his sharp ear caught the faint whinny of the big horse outside. He started like one caught in a guilty act, and sprang to the lantern. However, with his hands upon it, he thought better of it, and he placed the light against the wall. Then he turned to the entrance and looked anxiously up the hillside. What he saw was a form grotesque beyond belief. It seemed to be some gigantic wild beast, mountain lion or great bear, though of a size beyond credence, which slowly sprawled down the slope, walking erect upon its hind feet, with its forelegs stretched out horizontal, as if it were warning all who might behold it away. Haw Haw grew pale, and involuntarily reached for his gun as he first beheld this apparition, but instantly he saw the truth. It was a man who carried a burden down the mountainside. The burden was the carcass of a bear. The man had